On September 19th, 1796, President George Washington gave his farewell address to the nation. In this speech, he warned the budding nation about the perils of political factions. Washington said, quote, "The spirit of party politics agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. It kindles the animosity of one part against another." The two-party system that the nation has in place today has caused precisely what Washington feared, a nation divided. As someone who has worked closely with campaign groups and advocate for voter registration, I've seen firsthand the negative results of such a polarized political landscape. Party politics cloud common sense, and they distract people from coming to a true conclusion which has any kind of common ground. Our two-party system has caused a variety of issues, and three of the main ones that I want to talk about today are the dividing of our nation into completely oppositional factions who believe that it would almost be traitorous to compromise with one another, deterring moderates from engaging in the political dialogue, and discouraging third parties from running in political races. Think back to this past election. Who did you vote for? Was it somebody who held the same ideals that you had? Or was it simply somebody who was aligned with a party that you had voted for in the past? Was it someone that you thought would be a good leader and they'd earned your confidence? Or did you vote for them simply because you're comfortable and affiliated with their political party? Allow me to begin by explaining how the two-party system harms our social and political landscape. So, the first issue is that this system divides the nation by promoting this in-group, out-group mentality, which strains the political process. It's as if all of the teamwork is halved. Only half of the participants will actually work together, depending on which side you're on. According to the 2014 study on political polarization in America, conducted by the Odyssey Center for Politics, Democratic and Republican parties have continued to grow increasingly polarized since about 1879. But tracing the mixed grouping of ideals, which this is where Democrats and Republicans share very, very similar ideals, it was 1994 that we last saw Democrats and Republicans who shared ideals more than Democrats and Republicans who were completely polarized. In 1994, only 38% of Democrats and 43% of Republicans considered the oppositional party as unfavorable. However, in today's political landscape, with the increasing polarization due to the media and the way that certain political figures are personified, 79% of Democrats and 82% of Republicans consider the opposing party unfavorable. So this attitude creates a schism and animosity, which makes the two groups completely unwilling to compromise on even secondary issues. By drawing a line in the sand, both parties decide that they are completely unable to work with each other, and therefore they're unable to achieve any progress. There is distrust and antipathy, which is just further promoted by the media. So not only do you have politicians who are unwilling to work side by side with one another because they're on oppositional teams, but you also have the media perpetuating these stereotypes. In a 2016 poll, which was data concluded by the Washington Post, they found that most voters seem to get their news from sources that share the same views as they do. Therefore, if you're a Republican, you're going to look for news that is more Republican biased. If you're a Democrat, you're going to look for news that's more Democratic biased. The problem with this is that nobody really gets a full picture painted for them. So not only do you have two opposing teams who are playing in politics, you have two opposing groups of people who are just playing in the social sphere. Even people who are in the same workplace with one another oftentimes cannot compromise when it comes to things that may be a political-based decision, simply because their judgment is completely clouded and taken over by the media. So in addition to the problem of having these two people who are affiliated with these parties who have such strong opinions not being able to work with one another, it brings us to the second issue, which is the deterrence of moderates from even having any form of political discourse or dialogue. So moderate politicians and activists who would be much more willing to compromise on a variety of issues with a variety of groups of people are labeled party jumpers, and they are deemed less trustworthy because they don't stick with their exact party politics. They don't stick with that party's ideals. So both the public and other politicians, because they think they're not trustworthy, also have a tendency to deem them less assertive, less productive. They're much less likely to be called upon for joint sessions in the Senate, for example, and to be put on committees who reform bills in legislature. So you're essentially taking people who could actually be the most productive of all politicians because they're willing to compromise and work on issues with other politicians from other parties, and you're completely discounting them. They're just left in this murky mire of water where they float around and aren't really useful to anyone because they're completely not included in the political dialogue. But it's not just moderates that are affected by two-party politics. There's also an issue with third parties. Third-party candidates are often completely unable to make serious runs for political office because they have neither the money nor the staff to compete with the larger parties. The major players in politics who have run for president, for example, have almost always had to swap from an independent party that they may have been a part of to a larger one of the two parties. Ross Perot is an example of this. So is Paul Ryan, even Bernie Sanders recently. These were all people who had independent party ideals, but because they had absolutely no momentum in any kind of election, because they weren't part of these two large, powerful, wealthy parties, they wound up having to swap into those parties. The third-party candidates who actually are able to gain momentum, sometimes they're blamed for the failures of others. Ralph Nader is a good example of that. In 2000, Ralph Nader ran as a presidential candidate under the Green Party, and he amazingly did not have to swap into another party. He was able to run on his own merit and his own momentum. However, he had 2.8 million people vote for him, and instead of people who were politically aligned and like-minded applauding him for that, he was actually blamed for Al Gore's loss. So, as a third-party candidate, not only are you kept out of the political dialogue, you're oftentimes considered a liability. You're a risk. Nobody wants to vote for you because it might mean that somebody from the other party that's one of the big two won't get in. Essentially, the problems that are caused by the current two-party system are becoming increasingly visible. American politics seem completely devoid of common sense, and people are voting almost for a totem or an icon instead of the ideals that they actually believe in. It's painfully clear that what President Washington warned us about so many centuries ago has come to pass, and it's going to continue to put a strain on our social fabric. It seems hopeless. The money that the GOP and the Democratic National Party have make them far too powerful for a small group of concerned citizens to overthrow. But even small changes can eventually lead to larger revisions. So you might be asking yourself, what can we do? Well, first, we can make informed decisions. Instead of voting for somebody simply because they belong to a party, decide on the issues that matter the most to you and vote for the candidate that represents those beliefs. And then hold that candidate accountable for those. We need people who represent our ideals and people who are willing to compromise. We can challenge others to dig deeper as well. Ask other people to really think about what a candidate stands for and how likely they are to compromise to make real changes. If your colleagues identify as a certain political affiliation, you can remind them that straight ticket voting solves nothing and only continues to feed the two-party machine. We can support third-party candidates as well. If someone from a smaller party stands for what you believe in, back them by campaigning for them. Pass out flyers, join their campaign headquarters. If they really mean something to you, even if they're from a small party that has a small likelihood of winning, you should still try to support them. We won't change the system in one term, or in one decade, or even in one generation. It'll take time, but if enough voters show their disappointment in our current system and start to bring to light how it's failed us as a political community, then maybe we can open the door to more cooperative and trusting government leadership.